Lance Corporal Marcus Webb didn't whisper his insult. He launched it across the mess hall at Camp Lejeune, like a weapon designed to wound. Petty Officer First Class Vera Taskin was mid-reach for her water bottle when his shoulder connected with hers. Hard and deliberate. The impact sent her stumbling into the table edge. Her tray hit the floor with a crash that silenced half the room. Food scattering across scratched linoleum that had seen decades of similar confrontations. Webb saw exactly what he wanted to see: a lone sailor out of place on marine ground. Someone who wouldn't dare fight back. What he missed was the crescent-shaped scar on her left forearm. Memento from a breaching charge that detonated 6 inches too close during an extraction in Helmand Province. He didn't notice how her eyes instantly mapped every exit, catalogued every potential threat, identified improvised weapons within arm's reach. He had no idea the woman eating alone had spent 6 years embedded with Joint Special Operations Command intelligence units, training SEAL operators to pull high-value targets from places where conventional forces refused to operate. Webb thought he was putting a desk sailor in her place. He'd actually just started a confrontation with someone who survived 72 hours in a compound that should have been her tomb. The mess hall held its breath. The question wasn't whether Taskin would respond, it was what would happen when everyone discovered who she really was. August heat in coastal North Carolina feels like drowning on dry land. The humidity wraps around you, thick and suffocating, turning simple movement into effort. The main enlisted mess hall sat squat and ugly near the barracks rows, all cinder block and industrial functionality. Inside, fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, throwing harsh light across rows of scarred laminate tables and plastic chairs that had supported thousands of Marines over the years. Constant noise filled the space, silverware clattering, overlapping conversations, boots scraping across tile worn smooth by endless foot traffic. Vera Taskin, 29 years old and carrying more secrets than her service record suggested, sat alone in the back corner. She always chose corners, always kept her back protected and her eyes on the room. Old habits, from places where inattention meant death. Her tray held standard mess hall fare. Baked chicken that had seen better days. White rice cooked until it surrendered. Green beans boiled into submission. She ate with mechanical efficiency, the way someone eats when food is fuel rather than pleasure. Her hair was cropped short and practical, dark brown with premature gray threading through the temples. She wore a Navy working uniform Type 3. The blue-gray digital pattern that marked her as different, foreign, not quite belonging in this marine space. A black dive watch circled her left wrist, its crystal scratched, nearly opaque from hard use in places she'd never discuss. Her hands told stories if you knew the language. Scar tissue across the knuckles, calluses and patterns that suggested intimate familiarity with tools, ropes, weapons. That crescent-shaped scar on her forearm, the one she sometimes touched without thinking. A nervous habit left over from 3 years ago when a breaching charge decided to detonate at exactly the wrong moment. She'd been lucky, the medic said, half an inch different, and she'd have lost the arm entirely. 2 months at Lejeune now, assigned as a training liaison under administrative orders. Nobody quite understood. Navy personnel on Marine bases weren't unusual corpsmen, intelligence specialists, various support roles that kept the machine running. But Taskin didn't fit the usual patterns. She reported to a Marine major working out of the intelligence shop, handled vague training coordination duties that seemed to require remarkably little actual coordination, and maintained a social distance that made people notice precisely because she seemed so determined not to be noticed. Lance Corporal Marcus Webb had been watching her for weeks. 24 years old, built like someone who confused time in the gym with actual combat readiness. Regulation, high and tight haircut, a mouth that consistently wrote checks his experience couldn't cash. 2 deployments on his record went to Okinawa, doing training rotations that never saw action. 1 to Djibouti, pulling convoy security and relative safety. An ego inflated well beyond what those deployments justified. What bothered him wasn't that Taskin was Navy. Plenty of sailors worked alongside Marines without incident. What aided him was how she walked past him in passageways without the slightest acknowledgement, without the deference he'd convinced himself he'd earned. That crescent scar on her forearm caught light sometimes when she moved. He'd asked about it once, got a polite deflection, and the subject changed so smooth he barely noticed it happening. Most people stopped asking after similar experiences. Vera Taskin grew up in Kingman, Arizona, in a double-wide trailer that permanently smelled like gun solvent and her father's Camel cigarettes. Daniel Taskin had been forced reconnaissance in the early 80s, back before the term Marine Raider was resurrected, when recon Marines did work that never made it into official reports. He'd come home from Lebanon and Grenada, carrying psychological weight that never fully lifted, worked long-haul trucking routes during the week, spent weekends teaching his daughter things most fathers never considered. Land navigation by stars, weapon maintenance performed entirely by touch in complete darkness. How to think tactically when everything goes catastrophically wrong and the plan dissolves into chaos. He never told war stories, considered them self-indulgent and useless. Instead, he taught principles. Don't assume backup is coming. Don't trust equipment you haven't personally verified. Don't ever believe someone will save you just because they should. By 16, Vera could field strip an M4, blindfolded, and cover 12 miles with a weighted pack without complaint. Her mother had left when she was 9, unable to handle Daniel's silences and the ghosts he carried home from places he wouldn't name. After that, it was just the two of them, and he raised her the only way he understood how. She enlisted at 18, not because she needed direction or lacked options, but because her father told her once that the only way to discover what she truly made of is to be tested by people who do UNT. Care whether you pass. She chose Navy, selected cryptologic technician for the clearance as an intellectual challenge. Spent her first 3 years doing signals intelligence work aboard destroyers and at shore stations. That's when someone from JSOC's intelligence support activity noticed her. They never gave full names, just appeared after a training evolution where she'd identified a pattern in communications intercepts that 3 senior analysts had missed. They asked if she wanted to do work that mattered, work that would never appear in any official record, work that would test every assumption she'd ever made about her own capabilities and limitations. She said yes, without hesitation. The next 6 years erased any illusions about what intelligence work meant at the operational level. She wasn't analyzing signals from safe rooms anymore. She was on the ground with SEAL elements and Army Special Mission units, providing real-time intelligence support in denied areas where a single mistake meant capture, torture, or death. She learned to breach doors because operators needed extra hands, learned combat casualty care because medics couldn't be everywhere simultaneously, learned to move, shoot, and communicate like someone whose survival depended on those skills because it absolutely did. Helmand, Province, 2021. A 4-man SEAL element plus Taskin inserted to extract a high-value target with intelligence about an imminent, large-scale attack against U.S. forces in Kabul. The mission went catastrophically wrong when local militia forces surrounded the compound and severed all extraction routes. They held that compound for 72 hours against overwhelming numbers, rationing ammunition and water, treating wounds with whatever materials they could improvise. Taskin took shrapnel from a breaching charge that cooked off during an attempted breach, the crescent scar on her forearm, the only visible reminder. All 5 operators survived. The Havalia target made it out. The intelligence prevented an attack that would have killed over 200 American personnel. Lieutenant Marcus Brooks, the SEAL element leader, didn't survive Ramadi 8 months later. IED on a convoy route that should have been cleared. Taskin received notification through unofficial. Chancellor work was too classified for conventional casualty reporting. She carried Brooks with her. Not guilt exactly, but weight. The kind that accumulates when you survive situations where others don't. When you keep making it home while people you respect end up in flag-draped boxers. After Brooks died, she requested rotation out of the JSOC detachment, told her handler she was finished operating in places that didn't officially exist. They processed her transfer with a sanitized cover story about training liaison duties, and sent her to Camp Lejoyen with a service record that said absolutely nothing about the previous 6 years. The agreement she made with herself was simple. Keep her head down, perform administrative work nobody cared about. Try to become something other than a weapon until her 20 years were up and she could disappear into civilian life completely. 10. Marcos. Webb decided she needed reminding that women didn't belong in his Marine Corps. Webb wasn't born cruel, he was manufactured that way. Father who measured worth exclusively through physical dominance. Older brother who'd made it through Marine Raider selection and never let Marcus forget it. Webb grew up in that shadow, learned to throw punches before he learned fractions. Carried that mentality straight through boot camp and into the fleet, with the desperate hunger of someone trying to prove something to people who stopped watching years ago. His deployments Okinawa and Djibouti had been operationally quiet. Training exercises and convoy security. Nothing that tested him the way he'd imagined combat would. Nothing that provided the validation he craved. So he built his identity around the gym, around volume and aggression. Surrounded himself with junior Marines who mistook his behavior for leadership. When Petty Officer First Class Veritaskin appeared 2 months ago quiet, self-contained, utterly unimpressed by his presence, something in him fractured. It started small, comments in passageways, just loud enough for her to hear. Squid on a Marine base. Probably never left a nice safe ship. Bet she thinks she's special. Webb had 2 other lance corporals in his Orbithanias and Kohu, laughed on cue, and played their supporting roles. They'd shoulder check her in corridors, block her path at the post exchange. Small violations designed to establish hierarchy without crossing lines that would trigger official complaints. Taskin never responded. That's what drove Webb toward escalation. She just looked through him with eyes that seemed to calculate trajectories and threat assessments, then moved past like he was weathering. Obstacle to navigate around, but not worth engaging. The mess hall incident was deliberate. Webb planned it, waited until the room was crowded, made sure people were watching. When he shoved her and her tray crashed to the floor, when he delivered that insult loud enough to carry across the entire space, he expected a reaction. Tears. Maybe. Anger he could leverage into further humiliation. Instead, Taskin stood slowly, brushed rice off her uniform, and held his gaze for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. She didn't say a word, just turned and walked out with the kind of control that suggested violence was a choice she was actively declining. The mess hall stayed quiet for a beat. Then noise returned, but muted, careful. Staff Sergeant Clayton Morris, a combat engineer with 2 Fallujah deployments, sat 3 tables away. He didn't laugh. Maurice had worked with JSOC personnel in Iraq, recognized something in how Taskin moved to situational awareness, the economy of motion, how she'd cataloged the entire room before sitting down. He didn't know her story, but he knew enough to be concerned. Next morning, Webb and his crew were in the base gym when Taskin came in for her daily PT. She ignored them completely. Just moved to the pull-up bar and started her sets. 20 dead hang pull-ups. Without kipping, smooth and controlled, barely breathing hard. Webb watched from the bench press, felt his face heat with something adjacent to anger, and made a decision. He approached while she was hydrating between sets, told her Navy support personnel should know their place, told her she was occupying space. We are Marines. Told her if she couldn't handle Marine Corps culture, maybe she should request transferred back to a ship where she'd be safe. Said it loud enough that everyone in the gym heard clearly. Taskin drank her water, looked at him the way you'd look at a training problem you solved years ago, then went back to her pull-ups. Without acknowledging he'd spoken, Webb felt something crack inside his chest, humiliation mixed with rage, mixed with confusion about why his intimidation was unworking. He started planning something bigger, something that would force a response. He never got the chance. That afternoon, Captain Vincent Reeves, the company commander, called a mandatory formation for the following morning. Reeves was a prior enlisted Mustang who'd done time in force recon before commissioning, carried the kind of presence that made Marines straighten spines without raising his voice. He didn't explain the formation's purpose, just said attendance was mandatory and non-negotiable. Taskin sat on her rack that night in the mostly empty barracks berthing area, still in her PT gear. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and decades of accumulated sweat. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort required to maintain control when every operational instinct screamed at her to respond. She could have ended Webb in the mess hall, could have applied any of 24 techniques drilled into her over 6 years of close-quarters combat training, could have made him understand exactly how badly he'd miscalculated, but that wasn't the agreement she'd made with herself when she left the JSOC detachment. No more violence. No more operating in denied areas. Just quiet administrative work until her service obligation ended, and she could disappear into civilian life that didn't require constant threat assessment. She pulled off her dive watch, set it carefully on a foot. The crystal was scratched, nearly opaque from years of hard use. She'd worn it in Helmand when she helped CeeLo platoon develop breach plans for hardened compounds, worn it in Yemen during a 72-hour siege that should have killed everyone involved. Warned in Ramadi the day she received word that Brooks was dead. Brooks used to tell her the hardest part of their work was unto the danger it was coming back afterward and pretending you were normal. Pretending you hadn't done things and seen things that would give ordinary people nightmares for years. He said the trick was finding a line you wouldn't cross. Some boundary that defined who you were beyond operational requirements, and holding that line regardless of pressure. She thought walking away from JSOC was that line. Thought if she could just be a regular petty officer first class doing regular liaison work, she could bury Helmand and Yemen deep enough that they wouldn't matter anymore. But Webb had dragged it all back to the surface, not because he'd hurt her physically. She'd taken worse from actual enemies in actual combat zones, but because he'd made her visible, made her a target. The worst part was knowing that if she defended herself properly, if she showed even a fraction of what she was trained to do, questions would get asked. Her file would get pulled. The carefully constructed cover story about training liaison duties would collapse. She lay back on the rack, stared at water-stained ceiling tiles, and waited for dawn. The company formation assembled at 0600 on a Thursday that arrived cool and overcast. 140 Marines stood in ranks on the company parade deck, while Captain Reeves paced in front, hands clasped behind his back. 38 years old, a prior enlisted force recon Marine who'd earned his commission the hard way. He carried himself with quiet authority that came from leading men in actual combat rather than just training exercises. He didn't waste time on speeches. Said certain behaviors had come to his attention that violated basic standards of discipline and respect. Said those behaviors would be addressed through immediate action. Then he announced a leadership evaluation exercise starting immediately. Compressed, 3-day field assessment testing. Everything from land navigation to tactical decision-making under pressure. Results would become part of permanent service records, would influence future assignments and promotions. Reeves looked directly at Webb and said he expected Lance Corporal Webb to volunteer, given how vocal he'd been about standards and warrior culture. Webb's face flushed, but he couldn't back down in front of the entire company. He stepped forward. Reeves asked for 9 more volunteers. 7 Marines stepped up immediately, junior NCOs and senior Lance Corporals, looking to prove themselves. Then Reeves turned to Taskin, standing in the back rank in her Navy working uniform, and said he was specifically requesting Petty Officer First Class Taskin participate as both evaluator and participant, since her personnel file indicated instructor-level qualifications in small unit tactics from previous joint training assignments. The formation went dead silent. Webb looked like he'd been struck. Taskin kept her face neutral and stepped forward without hesitation. The assessment started at 0800. First evolution. 12-mile tactical movement with full combat load, across varied terrain, swamp, pine forests, open ground with simulated casualty scenarios requiring proper carries and treatment. Webb led out aggressively, pushing hard pace to establish dominance. Taskin stayed in the middle of the pack, moving with efficient economy that comes from carrying weight across hostile terrain where speed means survival. B-mile 8, 3 Marines had dropped out. Webb was still pushing, but his form was deteriorating, shoulders hunched, stride shortened, breathing ragged. Taskin hadn't altered pace once. Second evolution. Tactical, problem-solving exercise. Given a notional building clearance scenario with limited intelligence, told to plan and execute, Webb immediately tried taking charge, started issuing orders based on action movies rather than doctrine, treating it like a Hollywood sequence. Taskin observed for 2 minutes, then quietly asked the evaluators if she could make a recommendation. They told her to proceed. She sketched a plan in the dirt with a stick-proper room-clearing sequences that minimized exposure, covering fire positions, creating overlapping fields of fire, phased movement maintaining security throughout. She referenced tactics straight from Marine Corps and Army urban operations manuals, explained fatal funnels and angles of attack, laid it out with precision that came from planning real operations, where mistakes meant body bags. Webb tried to argue. Staff Sergeant Morris, acting as senior evaluator, told him to execute Taskin's plan. It worked flawlessly. The scenario completed without a single simulated casualty. Third, evolution designed specifically to break people. Came on day 2. Combat casualty care under stress. Multiple simulated casualties requiring immediate treatment. Limited supplies. Active simulated hostile fire using blank ammunition and pyrotechnics. Most participants froze or made critical errors: wrong tourniquet placement, incorrect airway management, failure to prioritize by severity. Taskin moved like she'd done this in actual combat because she had triaged by injury severity rather than proximity. Applied tourniquets with proper placement and tension while directing covering fire with verbal commands. When Webb panicked and tried applying a vented chest seal without checking for tension, pneumothorax, she corrected him, calmly showed him how to position the seal while the casualty exhaled, explained monitoring for tension signs, demonstrated the burping technique. If pressure built all, performed under actual fire in Helmand Province. The evaluator's staff, Sergeant Maurice and Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz, a former Marsac Marine, watched with increasingly narrowed eyes. Ortiz pulled Captain Reeves aside during a water break, said something that made Reeves nod slowly. Final evolution, 24-hour patrol-based defense, where participants had to maintain security, conduct planning, and manage leadership rotations without sleep. By hour 18, Webb was making critical errors. By hour 22, his tactical decisions would have gotten his entire team killed in a real scenario. Taskin stayed sharp throughout, rotated personnel efficiently, caught mistakes before they cascaded. When the assessment ended at dawn on day 3, 4 of the original 10 were still functional. Webb was among them barely. Taskin looked ready to continue indefinitely. Reeves called everyone to the parade deck for the debrief. Standing behind him was a Navy commander nobody recognized, wearing service dress whites with a chest full of ribbons that told stories about places and operations that never made the news. Commander Elizabeth Whitaker was 52, iron gray hair, pulled back in regulation bun. The kind of quiet intensity that made Taskin's spine straighten involuntarily. She wore naval special warfare insignia and ribbons, including multiple bronze stars with V device, a silver star, and several classified operation citations that appeared as generic service ribbons to anyone who didn't know the system. Whitaker didn't introduce herself with pleasantries. She asked Captain Reeves to dismiss everyone except the assessment participants and evaluating NCO. Once the parade deck cleared, she walked directly to Taskin and asked her to turn her head to the left. Taskin complied. The crescent-shaped scar on her forearm became visible in early morning light. Whitaker nodded once, then turned to address the exhausted Marines standing at attention. She said she was going to tell them about an operation that had been classified until recently but was now cleared for training discussion purposes. She asked if anyone recognized the designation Operation Crosswind. Nobody did. Webb looked confused, angry, and half-dead from 3 days without sleep. Whitaker explained that Crosswind was a joint JSOC operation conducted in Helmand Province in 2021. A 4-person SEAL element and 1 Navy intelligence specialist had been inserted to extract a Hivalia target with intelligence on an imminent large-scale attack against U.S. forces in Kabul. The mission was compromised when local militia forces surrounded the compound and cut off all extraction routes. The team held defensive positions for 72 hours against numerically superior forces with limited ammunition and no air support. All 5 operators survived. The high-value target was successfully extracted. The intelligence prevented an attack that would have killed over 200 American personnel. She paused, let that information settle. Then she said the Navy intelligence specialist on that operation had been cryptologic technician, first class, Vera Taskin, who had spent the previous 6 years attached to JSOC intelligence detachments supporting naval special warfare operations in denied areas across 3 continents. The parade deck went silent, except for wind in the pine trees. Whitaker continued, said Petty Officer Taskin had conducted direct action support missions, provided tactical intelligence under fire, trained SEAL elements in communication security, and counter-surveillance techniques, personally participated in operations that had saved hundreds of American lives, said the scar on her forearm was from a breaching charge accident during the Helmand operation, said she'd been awarded classified citations that couldn't appear in her official record. She said Taskin had requested rotation to conventional duty after her SEAL team leader was killed in Ramadi, and that her transfer had been processed through special channels to maintain operational security about her previous assignments. Webb's face had gone white. The other Marines stared at Taskin like seeing her for the first time. Whitaker turned back to Taskin and asked why she'd requested transfer out of the JSOC detachment to do administrative liaison work at a Marine base. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just direct. Taskin spoke for the first time in 3 days. Said she'd lost her team leader. Said she'd made a promise to try living a different life. Said she wanted to be done operating in places that didn't officially exist. Whitaker nodded like she understood completely. Then she said that based on Taskin's performance during the assessment, Captain Reeves had submitted a request for her permanent assignment as a combat instructor with the Marine Corps Martial Arts program at Quantico. Foot instructability, teaching next-generation Marines and sailors tactical movement, close quarters combat, and survival techniques in urban environments. No more administrative work. No more hiding who she was. She asked if Taskin would accept the assignment. Taskin looked at the other Marine Sat Webb who couldn't meet her eyes, at Staff Sergeant Morris who gave a slight nod of respect, at the evaluators who de-watched her work for 3 days and recognized something they'd seen before in other operators. She thought about Brooks, about the promise made in that Hellman compound, about whether teaching people to survive qualified as redemption. She said yes. Whitaker shook her hand, said the orders would be processed within the week. Then she dismissed the formation and left without ceremony, leaving Taskin standing alone on the parade deck while the sun finally broke through the overcast. Webb submitted a request for transfer to a different company within 48 hours. Captain Reeves approved it without comment, but added a formal counseling statement to Webb's record documenting the incident and assessment results. The paperwork would follow him. Word spread through the battalion faster than any official communication could travel. The quiet Navy petty officer Webb had assaulted in the mess hall was a confirmed JSOC operator with a classified service record that made most combat deployments look like training exercises. Taskin spent her final 2 weeks at Camp Lahoon, out processing and preparing for transfer. Marines who'd ignored her before now nodded in passageways. Staff Sergeant Morris bought her coffee at the post exchange, asked careful questions about Hellman that she answered in vague terms, confirming enough without violating her NDA. The base sergeant major personally thanked her for her service during a chance encounter outside the gym. On her final morning at Leoin, she found an envelope slipped under her barracks door. Inside was a handwritten note from Webb. 3 sentences. Said he was sorry. Said he'd let his insecurity turn him into someone he didn't respect. Said he was submitting a package for Marine Raider assessment and selection because he wanted to earn the right to call himself a warrior instead of just assuming the title. Taskin read it twice, then filed it in her personal effects. She didn't need his apology, but she respected that he'd written it anyway. The drive to Quantico took 6 hours through Carolina back roads and Virginia highways. She reported to the Marine Corps Martial Arts program on a Monday morning that smelled like fresh-cut grass and possibility. Master Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Coyle, the senior instructor with 3 Fallujah tours and a shelf full of close-quarters combat credentials, shook a hand and said he'd read her actual service record. Not the cover story, but the real one requiring special clearances to access. Said they didn't get many JSOC intelligence operators rotating through instructor billets. Said he was looking forward to learning from her. Her first class was 23 Lance Corporals, fresh from School of Infantry, all young and confident in the way new Marines always are. She stood in front of them in the training bay wearing a plain instructor-S uniform with her petty officer rank insignia and her scarred dive watch, and nothing else, indicating her history. She introduced herself, said she'd spent time in Helmand and Yemen and a few other places they might have heard about. Said she was going to teach them how to survive situations where most people died. Said the training would be hard but fair, and anyone who completed her course would have skills that could save their lives and their teammates' lives. Then she told them to partner up and get ready to work, because words were easy and the only thing that mattered was what you could do when everything went to hell. She thought about Brooks while they trained, about Yemen and Helmand, about the promise made in that compound while they'd waited to see if dawn would come. Maybe this was how you kept that kind of promise, by passing it forward to the next generation, teaching them to survive so they could go home to people who loved them, so they wouldn't become ghosts carrying weight they couldn't put down. The training bay filled with the sounds of Marines learning to fight, to move, to survive. Taskin walked among them, correcting stances, demonstrating techniques, watching them transform from uncertain kids into something harder and more capable. Outside, the Virginia sun climbed higher, burning off morning haze, and for the first time in 3 years, Vera Taskin felt like maybe she'd found a way to honor the dead without becoming one of them.